bit. Liberia was literally carved out as a nation, back in 1822 as a colony for freed American slaves, African American, of course, slaves. 1822. So the Emancipation Proclamation, black people in America, those slaves, are declared free men, and those who want to go home are now given a chance to go home. And they carved out this country in West Africa. They called it Liberia, after the word liberty, and they called it the capital Monrovia, after the 5th U.S. President, James Monroe. Just like that. Took a boat, arrived, 1822. They were there for another 22 to 47. About 25 years later, they declared Liberia a republic on July the 26th, 1847. Now, for the next 150 years, Liberia was the most peaceful, most prosperous, most developed country in Africa. Can you imagine? 150 years. Why? Well, you can argue that, the why, all day, all night. But here's the most critical part. Those who came back from America, the African Americans, actually they call them Americo-Liberians. That's what they call them. They started treating the native Liberians the same way they were treated in America. Subjugation. And for 150 years, very few questioned it. So they had president after president. That airport I told you we landed in, Roberts International Airport, it's named after the country's first president, John Jenkins Roberts. And they went on and on and on and on. Until one day, in April 1980, a low-ranking master sergeant in the army called Samuel Canyon Doe walked literally into the executive mansion, that's the presidential palace, walked into the bedroom of then President William Tolbert, shot him in the head. The next day, remember the story I told you about Jerry Rawlings in next door Ghana, or not too far away Ghana? The next day, Doe, Master Sergeant, lined up all the cabinet ministers on the beach, and in front of cheering crowds, had them all assassinated by firing squad. All the country's ministers. The other way, Doe was a Mandingo. His tribe is called Kran. Local. No ancestors from America. The very first time the locals were taking over. And he did that. And I tell you folks, that was 1980. By the time we were landing there in 1986, working for Pan Am, there had been several coup attempts. The one we remember when we were working there literally stopped everything by a captain called Thomas Kwiwangpa. He tried to take over, and he did for like several hours before he was captured, killed. His heart literally pulled out of his chest, and he was dragged through the streets of Monrovia. From there, everything went downhill. But before we come to that, here's a reminder that in the 70s, Africans from around the continent would make their vacation like they do in Dubai, in the south of France, in Switzerland, in Monaco. Africans would make Liberia their vacation spot. The country was so beautiful, so lovely. Remember that hotel I told you about, Hotel Africa, which we visited? Then President Tolbert had built 50 chalets when he was chairman of the Organization of African Unity. He had built 50 chalets on the beach and built that Hotel Africa. So it's a beautiful place. When we visited it during Pan Am, it was a fantastic place. Wonderful country, great people. But you could tell there were tensions, and it was building and building and building. So one of Doe's very personal friends, close, and he didn't have many close friends, one of his closest friends was an American educated Liberian by the name of Charles Taylor. Doe appointed him to a very high position as the head of the General Service Agency. Now, this agency was responsible for buying, purchasing everything for the government. Charles Taylor was in charge of that. Sure enough, everything he purchased, in typical Taylor style, he kept a percentage and he gave the government a percentage and built his war chest. One day, somebody went and told Samuel Doe, hey man, that guy of yours, he's stealing, man. He's stealing and he's taking a lot of money from you. Doe, without thinking, literally ordered for Taylor to be arrested. But before Taylor could be arrested, he heard about it and he escaped, got out of the country. And he flew to America, where he had gone to college, with what people say, plus minus $1 million in cash. He gets to the US, he's in Massachusetts. Doe, at that time, as chairman of the OAU, calls his colleague, Ronald Reagan, who was president then, and he says, listen, there's a guy from our country who's just escaped. He's somewhere in Massachusetts. Have him arrested and deported back to Liberia. Reagan does the right thing. Taylor is arrested. He's put in prison in a place called Piedmont. Yeah, I think Piedmont in Massachusetts. And he's held there for a while, waiting to be deported. Now, this is where things get really, really murky. It is said, according to legend, that while Taylor was in prison, he escaped using nothing more than a pair of bed sheets. Escaped from prison. Disappeared like Kaiser Sose. Never to be seen again. Other people say, oh, maybe he used some of that loot, the $1 million plus, to buy his way out of prison. Anyway, the story goes, Taylor escapes from prison, takes off to Africa, lands in Ghana. He's arrested there because he has no papers, no visa, no nothing. He's arrested and held for a while, and then he's released. By the way, he's on his way to Libya. He's been in touch with the general, the brother leader, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi. He's been in touch with him, and Gaddafi has offered to help him. So he lands in Ghana, wants to make his way through Burkina Faso all the way to Libya. On his way, or before he leaves, he visits a curio shop, and this is important for later on, where he sees a 6'4", 300-pound kid in the curio store. He's from Liberia. He's a refugee. He's escaped Liberia, and he's living in Abidjan. Oh, no, in Accra, sorry. And he looks at the kid, and they talk, and they find out they have the same accent. And he asks him, where are you from? He says, Liberia. And he says, oh, we're going to be going back to Liberia soon, and I'm putting together a unit to go back with. The kid, he's like 16 years old. His name was Max Farian Jiba. I'll tell you about him later on. So he was one of the first recruits of Charles Taylor. Cut a long story short, they make their way through Burkina Faso, end up in Libya. They train their troops, about, not that many, a few hundred. And then they come back, make their way back across the Mano River to the border of Liberia and Guinea-Conakry. On Christmas Day, 1989, Taylor announces that he's marching towards the capital. And he does. And he says in his message, he says, there's going to be fire coming out of the skies. So he's there with this group of rebels, trusted aides, and they start the march from the border all the way, slowly, village after village after village. And they do that from Christmas 89 into 1990. In the meantime, by the way, Doe is still in power. Remember? Samuel Doe, still in power in Liberia. There's two other rebel movements who have had enough of Doe, both led by gentlemen by the same name, Johnson. One was led by a guy called Prince Johnson, and another one by Roosevelt Johnson. No relation. But they were all now coming down slowly towards Monrovia. Charles Taylor is coming from the border. There's like a three-pronged movement to get rid of Doe. And the streets of Monrovia are littered with dead bodies. It was, the small boys unit I talked about in Sierra Leone? This was even worse. The SBU began in Liberia. 8, 10-year-olds with AK-47s and grenades and rocket-mounted grenades, launching them at innocent people in the streets because they want to control streets. Then Monrovia was about controlling the streets, and they did that. By the way, there was one rebel group led by a man I met later on. It was very famous or infamous at the time, called the Butt Naked Brigade. Why butt naked? The leader, a 19-year or 17-year-old kid, his name was Joshua Bly, changed his name later on while he was with this unit to the Butt Naked Brigade because he named himself General Butt Naked. And you ask yourself, why butt naked? Apparently, when they were going from street to street, like imagine in Nairobi, one street to another, if they knew there was a war coming or some conflict coming, they would take off all their clothes. Literally, take off all their clothes, splash themselves with all kinds of ointments and talismans, and go into battle completely, literally butt naked. Thinking, by the way, the thinking behind this was that the bullets from the other guys, they would bounce off of you, bounce off. Sure enough, a lot of them were killed during these battles because it's just dumb conclusion. But General Butt Naked survived. I would meet him later on. I'll tell you about it in a short while. So now these three brigades, Roosevelt Johnson, Prince Johnson, and Charles Taylor, they're making their way towards Monrovia. Doe is under siege. Peacekeepers are in town. They're trying to keep peace, which is what they're supposed to do. But it was madness at the time. Bodies littering the streets. Everybody, people scared to go into the streets. As they're approaching Monrovia, the capital, Doe calls for a summit for the regional leaders. And they all appear. And they all say, you know what, the one thing is, Doe has to go. Doe refused. He says, I'm not going. If you give me peacekeepers, I can keep the peace. Doe goes back to Monrovia. He's there. He's trying to fend off the rebels, trying to repel the rebels. One day, Prince Johnson, one of the Johnsons, Prince Johnson and his troops, they invade Monrovia, cause all kinds of havoc and devastation, and make their way to the executive mansion, Kenya's equivalent of State House or the White House in Washington, D.C., where the president lives. They made their way there. Doe is in the mansion. They captured Doe. Videos that have been seen, they're still available in the streets of Monrovia. They captured Doe, and they literally, there's a French crew in town, they start torturing Doe on camera. In one scene, they cut off his ear on camera, slice off his ear, and Doe is screaming, saying, oh, please, oh. And in the end, they cut off his genitals and cut off other parts of his body until Prince Johnson himself goes up to Doe and shoots him in the head. Boom! That's the end of that. Prince Johnson can't take over because there's Roosevelt Johnson over there, Charles Taylor behind. So now they have to enter into peace talks. And they do that for several months. Peace talks, back and forth, back and forth. In the end, they said, okay, they struck a deal. We'll have elections in 6 months. And they all put down their arms and all went to start campaigning. Prince Johnson, Roosevelt Johnson, Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor, the wickedest, they say, of all. He sent out a message, says, if you guys don't elect me, Liberia will be a bloodbath. That's the message, he said. And people were so scared along the way. So scared. Sure enough, elections are held. Charles Taylor becomes president. He's elected. And he gets into the executive mansion. And he surrounds himself with all these guys that he's been with in the bush. Remember that kid I told you about, the 300-pound, 6'4" guy? Max Ferry and Jiba? By the time I met him later on, he had changed his name to, because all these guys had what they call nom de guerres, war names that they call themselves, titles. So Max Ferry and Jiba had now become Bulldog. Perfect description. That's exactly what he looked like. He was inside the presidential mansion as the guy in charge of what they call the ATU, the anti-terrorist unit. That was Jiba. There was another guy, short, slim built, quiet, hardly ever spoke. His name was, I know his nickname was 50. Benjamin Yetin was his name. Benjamin Yetin. Quiet. He never spoke. Always next to Taylor. When you saw Taylor on any press briefing or press conference, Benjamin was right there next to him. His code name was 50. I actually once asked the guys, why do they call him 50? They said, in the first battle, because he started off with Taylor from the beginning. His first battle, he killed 50 men. First battle. When Taylor would go to sleep, 50 would be sleeping right on the floor in the same room. That's how much Taylor trusted that guy, and vice versa. There were others with ridiculous names. There's a guy we met in the field called General Cuckoo Dennis. And we asked, why do they call him General Cuckoo Dennis? He said, because the guy's cuckoo. Every time he kills a rebel, he slits open the chest, pulls out the heart, and drinks the warm blood before it gets cold. The warm blood. That way, according to General Cuckoo Dennis, he would possess his enemy. Can you imagine? Ridiculous. I met a guy called Mosquito and all kinds of Terminator, all kinds of crazy names. Liberia. Remember that country that was peaceful for 150 years? Had now spiraled into violence and death and destruction and despair. It was horrible. And Taylor in the middle of it all. So there we are back then, 2003. And things are getting ugly because now there's another new rebel movement calling itself LURD, Liberians United for Reform and Democracy, LURD. They are now saying, you know what, Taylor has to go. He's been there 6 years and change. He hasn't done anything. We're going to attack the mansion. And they started making their way slowly. And we're on the ground, we're reporting. And I tell you, man, what? So many people were killed in that. Bodies again in the streets. It seems like a cyclical thing. Every few years, rebels invade, they storm the city, and they kill a lot of people. In the end, cut a long story short, President Olusegun Obasanjo, remember my friend from Nigeria? He arrives in Monrovia, holds talks with Taylor, has a press conference, and he says, President Taylor has agreed to come to Nigeria in exile. And the world is stunned. And we're there, we're reporting live. What? He's agreed. He's going to come to Liberia. President Obasanjo has given him exile status. All this news is relayed. The rebels obviously don't believe it. And they keep pounding the city. One day, we're reporting in the streets, and I get a call from a place called White... oh, goodness, I forget the name of the mansion. It was President Taylor's residence. White Flower, they called it. White Flower was the president's residence in a place called Congo Town. He calls me, he says, Jeff, where are you? I said, I'm in the streets, Mr. President. I'm here filming. He says, come over to White Flower. I make my way. It's about August the 6th or the 7th in 2003. We make our way. And he says, as we make out, we go there, we find him in the courtyard with his phalanx of bodyguards. And he says, hey, man, I hear it's nasty out of the street. I says, yeah, Mr. President, that's why we're wearing bulletproof flak jackets. He says, look, all this talk about me leaving and going to Nigeria, I want the world to know that it is true. I want you to tell the world, I am going to leave. I'm sick and tired of fighting all these enemies. I'm going to leave for the sake of peace. Exclusive. We put that out. It's aired all over the world. Taylor's going to leave. Sure enough, he announced the date, August 11th, and we were there reporting live as he stood there in the executive mansion saying, God permit, I will be back. He said that those are his last words before leaving. Got to the airport, got on a plane that was chartered by the Nigerian president, ended up in Nigeria, a place called Cross River State. That's where he would be for another 2, 3, 4 years.